In the 1960s, America found itself in the middle of a growing public debate. What influence do television, radio, comic books, and movies have on children? Revelations about the television industry and the gradual end of advanced censorship in the movie business only intensified the discussion. The main concerns centered on the sheer amount of violence, crime, and sexual content on screens. Parents and educators also wondered how all this affected schoolwork, homework habits, and children's interest in reading good books. Let's start with violence and crime. During that decade, some judges, prosecutors, and psychiatrists noticed a troubling pattern. When serious young offenders were asked where they had gotten the idea for their crime, many responded with surprising simplicity. "I saw it in a comic book," or "it was on a TV show." For these professionals, that sounded like direct evidence that a child could be deeply corrupted by such media. But most psychiatrists disagreed with that conclusion. They acknowledged that plenty of content on television and in comics was unhealthy, especially for certain children. They admitted that a cruel or aggressive youngster might pick up a clever or vicious idea from something he'd seen, but they insisted that no normal child could be transformed into a criminal. After any number of hours spent watching or reading, most parents felt the same. They knew their children had seen countless fictional villains without experiencing a change in character. A child's fundamental values come from home. If parents are decent, kind people who love their child, he or she loves them back and naturally uses them as models. This is how a conscience is formed, a guide that keeps a person out of serious trouble later on. Of course, as children grow older, their developing standards are influenced, though to a lesser degree, by teachers at school and Sunday school, by classmates, friends, and the parents of those friends. Even adolescents rarely make drastic shifts in values based solely on peers. Although the urge to conform is powerful at that age, teenagers tend to choose friends who were raised with similar expectations. Defenders of television sometimes argued that previous generations grew up hearing fairy tales full of cruelty. But it's hard to imagine that several hours of harsh stories every night would have been harmless for small children, especially sensitive ones, who were known to get nightmares even from old-fashioned tales. What mattered most was how a story was experienced. When a mother read aloud, a child's imagination was limited by personal experience. Her warm voice and explanations constantly reminded the child that the events were make-believe, and that both she and the child disapproved of the villains. Television, on the other hand, presented cruelty through live actors in realistic settings, night after night. That repetition could give a child the impression that brutality was common and socially accepted. One nursery school teacher noted that after a slapstick-heavy TV show became popular, her pupils began hitting each other casually, explaining, "That's how they do it on the program." No one claimed that good children were turning bad, but it was clear that standards could be lowered and a child's view of humanity distorted. Parents' attitudes toward TV shows and comics had a significant impact on how children interpreted what they saw. When parents monitored content, expressed concern, and forbade certain programs or comic strips, they reinforced the ideals they expected their children to hold, even if the children still tried to sneak a look. When parents showed no disapproval, children assumed there was nothing wrong. Psychologists had long pointed out that even well-adjusted children possess aggressive impulses, which can be safely released through pretend play, stories, or shows, containing a reasonable amount of conflict. But the amount and type of conflict mattered. A cartoon mouse punching a lion on the nose was humorous, a small hero standing up to a bully. But the sight of a real human face being brutally struck by a criminal was an entirely different emotional experience. Many parents in the 1960s disliked the programs their children watched. Yet whenever they tried to forbid a show or limit screen time, children protested. It was the best show. All their friends watched it, and only their parents were mean. Strong-willed mothers and fathers stood firm, but others caved under the pressure. Some gave in immediately. Others relaxed their rules after a few days, suspected their children were watching the forbidden show again, but avoided confrontation. The same confusion arose around comic books and movie-going. This highlighted an important point. Parents rarely struggled to set rules in areas governed by strict traditions when they were young. Bedtimes, table manners, honesty, proper language. But television was new. There were no traditions to follow, no clear guidelines. Reports from other families conflicted. Parents tried to craft reasonable rules, but when their children strongly resisted, their confidence weakened. Children sensed this uncertainty and intensified their arguments. Parental confidence had also been shaken by broader cultural changes. Psychologists, psychiatrists, educators, and pediatricians had entered the child-rearing conversation, publishing books and delivering lectures about children's needs and problems. The unintended effect, especially on conscientious parents, was the fear that they were just as likely to do harm as good. On top of that, the rapid rise in living standards, especially after World War II, destabilized traditional family patterns. History showed that sudden shifts in lifestyle could weaken family discipline. Paradoxically, prosperity proved more disruptive than depression or even war periods of unusual well-being, often produced increases in delinquency, crime, and even suicide. When parents offered their children a world entirely different from the one in which they themselves had grown up, they found fewer familiar guideposts and had to navigate on instinct. From the earliest days of children's movies, radio, and TV, doctors had heard from mothers about highly sensitive youngsters who were frightened by what they saw or heard. These children cried, feared bedtime, or suffered nightmares. A few were sensible enough to avoid such programs altogether, but most, being human, kept returning to the very shows that scared them. In those cases, parents had to be wiser than their children and prevent further harm. A large proportion of children under 6 were sensitive in this way. Writers of the era recalled taking their own children to special cartoon showings. Adults and older kids laughed happily, while many younger ones cowered in fear. These episodes reminded adults that wild animals or evil stepmothers in cartoons could feel as terrifying to a 3-year-old as real threats. Up to this point, the discussion had focused on violence and fear. But there was also the issue of sexual content, especially in movies. One writer recalled going to a neighborhood theater to see a foreign film, only to be surprised with a sneak preview of another movie. The first film was excellent. The second, which would never have passed the old censorship board, was so crude by American standards that the audience reacted with embarrassed giggles. Children seek knowledge about life gradually, at each stage of development. They ask parents if their parents create an open atmosphere. They learn from older siblings, from friends, at school, in books, magazines, movies, and TV. Rates of emotional and sexual maturity vary widely. Some children are precocious, others shy, and slow to seek information. More important than the information itself is the emotional atmosphere in which a child learns. Loving parents tailor explanations to the child's readiness and present them in harmony with family values. Teachers start with biology and venture into personal matters only if students guide them there. But information pushed by a worldly child onto a more sheltered one can shock rather than enlighten. Likewise, a movie inappropriate for a child may introduce aspects of sexuality far beyond the child's emotional capacity, often presented through characters whose lifestyles differ dramatically from anything familiar. As for the impact of television on schoolwork and reading, studies were inconclusive. In most American elementary schools, homework was minimal or non-existent, since research showed it didn't improve performance. Thus, heavy TV viewing rarely interfered with young children's schooling. High school students, assigned homework primarily to develop study habits, typically had enough self-discipline to prioritize academics. And by then, some of the early obsession with television had faded. At any age, some individuals procrastinated by watching TV, but blaming the medium for avoidance was unfair. Still, many educators were optimistic about television's long-term impact. They believed that despite its drawbacks, factual and educational programs broadened children's horizons and inspired them to learn more. Parents who valued literature feared that comic books would ruin their children's reading tastes. But time proved otherwise. After years of indulging in comics, most teenagers outgrew them and moved on to books appropriate to the family's intellectual level. During the war, the majority of GIS read comic books as well, but it was doubtful that they would have been reading Dickens if comics hadn't existed. Ultimately, a person's adult reading habits were shaped less by what they read at age 9 and more by the cultural atmosphere in which they were raised. So what were parents supposed to do when the effects of television, movies, and comics remained so uncertain? As always, different families chose different approaches. Some had lofty aspirations for their children's tastes and ideals. Others were content to let nature take its course. Experts encouraged dissatisfied parents to hold their ground and resist pressure from children or from neighborhood opinion. One effective method of improving the quality of children's entertainment was direct communication, writing to local theater managers, TV station executives, networks, and sponsors. Few citizens used this privilege, but evidence showed that even a small number of sincere letters or calls made a strong impression. When children planned to see a movie, responsible parents checked its suitability by reading newspaper reviews, consulting parent or religious publications, or calling the theater, just as they monitored their children's friends and activities. Likewise, they needed to keep track of what their children watched on television or read in comic books, and they shouldn't hesitate to forbid content that clearly conflicted with family ideals. But when it came to television, it was short-sighted to consider only the influence individual parents could exert. In the early 1960s, the nation still had a unique opportunity, a moment in which concerned citizens could push for a review commission to take a fresh look at all aspects of broadcasting and make informed recommendations for the future.